Здравствуйте, welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today is day 17, and today is probably one of the most important and, in some ways, most difficult, but also most interesting lessons in the entire book. Namely, we're finally introducing aspect, verbal aspect, right? We've mentioned that here and there as we were learning how to conjugate verbs. So today we'll finally reveal what this is all about. And as we do so, we'll also say pretty much everything there is to say about tense in Russian. We've already, of course, seen tense. We've talked about the tenses of the verb быть, right, to be, and we learned that Russian has only three tenses, right, present, past, future. And today we're going to see how other verbs play out across those three tenses. So why is aspect so tricky? Well, because English doesn't have aspect, at least not in the sort of grammatically systematic way that Russian and all Slavic languages have aspect, right? So that makes aspect difficult for English speakers in a similar way that uh, well, similarly to the way in which articles are hard for Russian learners, right? If you're coming from a language that doesn't have articles, right, like a or the, right, it's very hard at first to know what those words are even doing, what they mean, how you choose between them. And you may notice if you have Russian friends and they're working on their English, uh, see what happens the first time they ask you about an article, right? Should we use an indefinite article like a? Should we use the definite article the? Or should we have no article at all, right? And when you have to reflect on that, you may realize that even as a native speaker, although you sort of know what the right answer should be, kind of intuitively and also drawing richly on the context in which the thing is being said, right? That when you go to try to articulate or explain why you're making the choice you're making, it can be almost impossible, right? It can really stump a lot of speakers. And it's only then that you realize how much is going on, going into just what seems to be a simple choice between articles. Okay, so it's kind of similar with aspect, right? This is um, uh, a pretty complex topic that we're going to have to take a lot of time to talk about, right? At first, it's going to be very unusual, right? Just this idea that every time you use a verb in Russian, you're going to have to be thinking and choosing your verb form in terms of this category that is completely foreign to you, right? This category of aspect, right? Uh, Now, one thing we're going to do is break up this topic. We're going to start today and in books one and two with what I call basic aspect, right? That basically means that we're going to choose uh, aspect based on three rather clear-cut criteria, right? Such that often, at least in books one and two, our choice of aspect is going to be pretty clear, and there's going to be kind of a right or wrong answer, right? So we're going to try to keep it simple. And the stuff we're learning today, what I call basic aspect, just kind of my rough estimate, will probably um, account for maybe 75% of aspectual choice, right? But we are going to leave a few things unsaid, and we're going to save those for book three when we'll introduce what I call advanced aspect, that will treat aspect in a slightly more um, complex way, right? Uh, and in a way that underscores the fact that often choice of aspect isn't right or wrong. It rather is based on context and on what the speaker is choosing to emphasize within the given context, right? So uh, I often joke that basic aspect, what we'll learn today, is sort of like Newtonian physics, whereas advanced aspect is sort of like the theory of relativity, right? Because everything's relative, right? It's all based on the context and on, again, emphasis within context. So again, as you can already guess, right, this is a pretty complex topic. It's a difficult one. Um, anyway, I'll say more on this later. Let's dive right in. And I thought before we try to systematize our approach to aspect, let's just look at four posters and comment on the verbs they're using. What aspect are the verbs? Why was the given aspect chosen over the other? And let's kind of wade in gently that way. Okay, so let's look at the first poster here. Отстоим Москву. Okay, needless to say, we haven't seen a lot of these verbs. We're just looking at examples. And when we do learn new verbs in a text, for example, or in the vocab, from now on, we'll be listing them as aspectual pairs. More on that in a moment, but you see one such pair here, отстаивать, отстоять. So we have two infinitives separated by a forward slash. The first infinitive is imperfective. The second is perfective, right? So here отстаивать is imperfective and отстоять is perfective. And both of those verbs mean to defend, right? Now, we've mentioned already in some of our tables, right, when we were conjugating verbs, we just kind of mentioned in passing that some of them were perfective. And when you conjugate those perfective verbs, the resulting forms are automatically future tense. And that's what we have here, right? Отстоим Москву, that form отстоим is from the verb отстоять, right? It's not отстаиваю, that would be the imperfective, but rather отстоим, which is from the verb отстоять. So it's perfect. It's a perfect verb in terms of aspect, or perfective, I should say, perfective, right? It has perfective aspect. Okay, that means that this verb here, again, is future tense. We would translate this poster as we will defend Moscow. Now, why is perfective chosen here? Because perfective forms emphasize not a process or an attempt, but rather a completed action, and in this case, a successful action, right? And not an attempt, but a successful, completed action, right? So the idea here, of course, isn't that we'll go about defending Moscow or we'll try to defend Moscow, but rather we will defend Moscow to the very end. We will successfully fight off the Nazis and defend Moscow. So that idea of completion and success here is being communicated through the choice of aspect. Let's look at the next poster. Ты будешь жить счастливо. You will live happily. Okay, here we have, this is also future tense, and the verb we learned yesterday, жить, happens to be imperfective, right? So we see here that, in the first poster, we formed the future tense for perfective verb simply by conjugating it. If the verb happens to be imperfective, it forms a compound future using the forms of быть, right? Буду, будешь, будет, and so forth as a helping verb, right? Sort of like in English, you will live, right? We use that helping verb will to form the future tense, you will live. Okay, why is imperfective used here? Because the idea is that of a future process, right? A long life, the long activity of living happily, right? Not completion, not success, but just the activity itself, right? Ты будешь жить счастливо. Okay, let's look at one more. This is kind of similar to the first one. Защитим город Ленина. We will defend the city of Lenin. Okay, our pair here is защищать, защитить. And you see there the imperfective verb, the first one, защищать, is an I verb. The second one, защитить, is an E verb. Okay, so let's look at the form in the poster and ask which one is that? Is that a conjugated form of защищать or защитить? Well, of course, it's an E verb, right? It's clearly a form of защитить, meaning it's perfective. Okay, so knowing this verb form is perfective, what is it getting across? First of all, it's future tense, right? We simply conjugate a perfective verb. The result is future in meaning. And here it's also emphasizing, again, the idea of success, right? It's not that we'll go about trying to defend the city of Lenin, right? That doesn't sound very ideologically acceptable, right? We're going to successfully defend the city of Lenin, right? So again, that idea of success and completion is communicated by the choice of the perfective verb защитить. Okay, one more. Let's look at a past tense form. Мы победили. We have won. Okay, this is from the aspectual pair побеждать, победить. Again, you see the imperfective побеждать is an I verb. The perfective победить is an E verb. Okay, what what verb form have we used? Do we see here? Well, we can see already probably that победили is the past tense form of победить, not побеждать. Okay, why is so it's perfective, right? Okay, why does perfective make sense here? Well, because we're stating an accomplished fact, right? The war is over and we have completely won, we've successfully won, it's over, right? And we're emphasizing the successful result uh, of the action, not the activity or the attempt or something like that. Okay, so let's try to talk about aspect now more systematically, right? We've already seen basically the gist of it, right? That all Russian verbs come in aspectual pairs. So here's maybe the easiest way to think about that. If you were asked, how do you say to read in Russian, right? What's the Russian for to read? Okay, you might remember the word we used as our head verb for I verbs, right? Chitать. Chitать means to read. Okay, so let's give that as our answer, chitать. Okay, is that correct? Only halfway. You're only halfway there, right? It's sort of only half right. Of course, chitать does mean to read, but it only means to read imperfectively. It's an imperfective verb. Okay, to really talk about reading in Russian, we need to know two verb forms, right? That is, we need to know an aspectual pair of verbs for the English verb to read, right? That pair in Russian is читать, прочитать. Читать, прочитать. And again, we're going to write it up like this. Читать, I, right? That's our imperfective verb. And of course, we're going to tag it by type. Then forward slash, right? Um, separating the imperfective from the perfective. And the perfective is прочитать, прочитать. So that's the full answer to the question, how do you say to read in Russian? Читать, прочитать. Right? So to really know that verb, you've got to memorize that pair. Читать, прочитать. You've got to memorize two imperfectives, and then of course know how each infinitive is, two infinitives, and know how each infinitive is conjugated. Okay, that may seem like terrible, terrible news, right? Oh my God, for each single verb in English, we've got to learn two verbs in Russian. But if you think about it and maybe compared to other languages you've studied, this actually isn't that bad. You know, for almost any language, especially any European language, you have to learn a certain number of so-called principal parts for verbs, right? Maybe you've studied Latin where most verbs have four principal parts, or maybe like a Germanic language where uh, verbs have at least three just principal parts that you just have to learn, basically just memorize, right? Um, okay, so in Russian, in a lot of ways, it's not really that bad. Two basically principal parts, it's not really that big of a deal, right? We just need to memorize two infinitives. Now, we're going to talk more tomorrow about how these aspectual pairs are created, right? That's kind of a different topic. Today, we're going to focus mostly on just a few pairs, like читать, прочитать, and just talk very carefully about what's the difference between an imperfective verb and a perfective verb. Okay, so let's look at this little table. And again, this may be a case of sort of overkill in a way, but I'm trying to be really exhaustive and really try to um, talk about this very carefully. So let's just take our basic pair we just discovered, читать, прочитать, right? That's the pair meaning to read. Читать is the imperfective version. Прочитать is the perfective version. Okay, what does this term mean, imperfective? Well, actually, let's start by asking the question, what does perfective mean? That's maybe easier. Well, perfect, we know what that means in English. It's related to the Latin perfectum, which is basically a participle meaning finished, right? Per facere is the verb. It's a participial form from that, meaning finished, right? So the more literal meaning of perfect is completed or finished, right? It's perfect in the sense that nothing else can be done to it. It's already complete, right? So that maybe will help us remember that perfective aspect describes completed action. It emphasizes completed action, whereas imperfective verbs, right, just negating the perfective, right, imperfective, describe uncompleted action, incomplete action, or rather ongoing action. Okay, so that's our first criterion, right? Imperfective verbs describe ongoing action, right? Just the activity itself, the ongoing, uh, with no mention of the result, right? Just we're simply talking about the activity itself, not the result. Whereas perfective verbs describe a completed action and they emphasize result, right? Again, not the activity, but the result, the completion of the action. Okay, our second criterion, also very important, imperfective verbs can describe repeated action, right? So if you're doing something, carrying out one action multiple times, or maybe habitually, right? Something you do every day by habit, right? Any kind of repetition, that type of action is going to have to be described by an imperfective verb in Russian. Whereas a one time action, right? No repetition, just a one time complete action is going to be described by a perfective verb in Russian. Okay, the third criterion is not quite as important and it doesn't figure quite as often as the first two, but it's also important, and in certain cases it can be really important, right? Uh, an imperfective verb can describe uh, an attempt or effort, whereas a perfective verb, as we saw in the posters, can describe success, right? An actual accomplishment as opposed to just an attempt or an effort. Okay, if we think about that, we can see that that kind of follows logically from criterion number one, right? What is an effort? Well, or an attempt? Well, it's basically being in the process of doing the action, right? You're in the process of performing the action, whereas success is completing the action, right? You're no longer in the process of trying to get something done, rather, you've completely done it. And one way to think about that is successfully doing it, right? So attempt, effort, striving, activity versus completion, success, result, that type of thing. Okay, so those three criteria, and that's it really. Those are our three criteria for choosing between the two aspects, right? So when we go to choose between, for example, читать, прочитать, we've got to think, well, what type of reading are we doing? Is it this kind of ongoing activity, or maybe an attempt to get a book read? We're in the process of reading through it. Maybe we do it every day, right? It's a repeated action. Or are we talking sort of about perfective, where it's one time, completed, finished, uh, success? Uh, we're emphasizing maybe the result, the accomplishment, right? So it's maybe one way to kind of visualize this kind of ongoing idea versus bam, right? One time completion, success, result, that type of thing is going to be conveyed by perfective verb. Okay, let's point out the obvious. For the vast majority of Russian verbs, right, they're going to come in these pairs. So every time a Russian uses a verb, almost every time, right, there are a few exceptions to this, they've got to make this choice, right? It's an either or proposition. There's no getting around it, right? You've got to choose. Is it читать, прочитать? Okay, so we've just given the three basic criteria for making that choice. Now, here's a mistake, and we'll revisit this carefully when we get to advanced aspect. You often hear students or sometimes instructors say things like, well, aspect is very subtle, right? It's a very subtle thing. Um, no, it's not subtle at all. And that's really the problem, right? It may strike learners as subtle, right? That we have to think about all these things every time we choose a verb. The problem is that for a Slavic speaker, a Russian speaker, the choice is just crystal clear, right? It's kind of like for us choosing articles, right? We just make this choice without even thinking, but sort of the right or wrong answer is just glaringly obvious in most cases, right? Of course, trying to explain it may be another matter, right? So if you go again and maybe ask a Russian friend, hey, what aspect should I use here? Well, first of all, they may be like, what are you even talking about, right? Like, they may be a little rusty on the grammar. By the way, if you do want to ask a Russian, the Russian for aspect is vid. Uh, imperfective, well, let's start with perfective. Perfective aspect in Russian is совершенный вид. And совершенный means completed or kind of perfected, completed, right? Совершенный вид is perfective aspect, and несовершенный вид, right? Simply negating it, несовершенный вид is imperfective, right? So if you do want to ask this question to a Russian friend or a Russian, maybe you have a native speaker who's teaching your class, that'll be the term they would use. Uh, right, but again, even if they know the term, they may, just an ordinary speaker who doesn't teach Russian or hasn't really thought about grammar may have a hard time explaining these things to you. So it's a rather interesting topic in that sense. Uh, okay, so let's take a breath and now talk more about tense. Refer back to this table, and right, now that we've talked about the aspectual distinction, we need to talk about how do we use these two verbs, right? Imperfective, perfective across the three tenses, right? Now, once we've learned this, we're going to know a lot about Russian verbs. I mean, we're really covering a lot of territory today. So once today's lesson is over, if you feel at all comfortable with it, you've really covered a lot of ground in Russian, right? And it's only day 17, right? But of course, be gentle, right? Be kind to yourself. It's going to take a while to really master aspect. It's not the kind of thing you're going to just be using spontaneously overnight. It'll take practice. Okay, so what about tense? Well, we know, looking back at the table, there are three tenses in Russian: present, past, future. Okay, so now let's think about those three tenses in terms of aspect. What about present tense? Okay, we see here that only imperfective verbs are used in the present tense. Okay, that's kind of interesting, right? So if we're speaking in the present tense in Russian, our choice is clear. We have to use imperfective verbs. Why does that make sense logically? Uh, well, because if an action is present tense, right, if it's in the present, then by definition, it's still unfolding, right? It's still ongoing, right? So that makes perfect sense, actually. So essentially, if we want to talk about reading in the present, right? I am reading, I read, I do read, right? Any of those things, present tense, we have no choice but to use читать, right? For example, мы читаем. Okay, so that's pretty simple in Russian. Now, underneath that form мы читаем, I've given just a few translations based on the three um, criteria, right? Now, again, this is kind of sloppy, kind of a mess in the sense that English has a lot of different tenses, right? So we talked about that already, right? So this is not necessarily an exhaustive treatment of translation, but just for example, we are reading. That could mean we're in the process of reading, right? We are reading this novel. We're in the process of reading it. Or we read, right? We read every day. Every day we read the newspaper. That could suggest kind of repetition or habit. Or we are reading in the sense of we're trying to read. We're trying to get through this Russian novel, right? That could talk about attempt, right? But again, all of those meanings, and in this case, of course, the present tense is conveyed by aspect, right? Just читать. Okay, what about, let's actually jump down to the very bottom row, right? We just mentioned that прочитать, like any perfective verb, can't be used in the present. It makes no sense in the present tense. We can't use it at all. But we know already that, well, look, прочитать is an I verb, right? Just like читать, they're both I verbs. They're going to be conjugated in the same way. So what happens if we conjugate прочитать? Прочитаю, прочитаешь, прочитает, right? We know how to do that already. But what do those forms mean? If they can't be present tense, then what do they mean? Well, again, we glimpsed this already. If we conjugate a perfective verb, the resulting forms are future in meaning. They are future tense, right? So again, jumping down to the bottom row, we get, for example, мы прочитаем, мы прочитаем. Okay, so that means we will read. That's a future tense form. We'll read completely. We'll read once. We'll read successfully, right? Based on context, it could convey any of those ideas, right? Uh, Now, again, let's think a moment. If we see this form in a Russian text, мы прочитаем, right? Прочитаем. That's future tense. How do we know that that's future tense? Simply by knowing that prочитать is a perfective form, right? That's the only way we can possibly know that that form прочитаем is future tense, right? And by the same token, how do we know that читаем is present tense? Well, simply by knowing the pair, right? Читать, прочитать, right? We have to know that читать is an imperfective verb. Therefore, its conjugated forms, читаю, читаешь, читает, are present tense, right? So that's one rather simple and obvious and also rather troublesome sense in which memorizing Russian verbs as pairs is so essential, right? If you don't know the pair and don't know which is which, you don't even know the tense of these conjugated verb forms you see, right? That's obviously a very important thing. Now that mistake right there is extremely common, it's really hard to get rid of. It happens into second semester, into the second year of Russian, because I mean, students, let's be honest, they're maybe, well, I don't want to use the term lazy, right? But they're, of course, some of them aren't really too gung ho about mastering Russian, which is fine, obviously. But again, the dirty little secret for those of you who are really intent on learning Russian is you have to learn these pairs, right? There is absolutely no getting around it. How do you learn the pairs? Drilling, drilling, and drilling, right? It's just like any other vocab item. You've got to basically repeat it over and over, write it out, like write out the pairs, читать, прочитать, right? And every time you see a form of the verb to read in Russian, you've got to think, okay, what aspect is this? Is it a form of читать, imperfective, or is it прочитать, the perfective, right? And again, that distinction is going to account for all sorts of differences in meaning, including tense, right? Present tense versus future tense. Now, while I'm on the subject, we're going to talk more soon about how these aspectual pairs are formed. At first, it can seem rather arbitrary, but like so many things in language, the more of these pairs you learn, the easier it will get. And at some point, we're going to revisit this topic in book three, I think, right in book three, and we're going to learn more about how these pairs are formed. We're going to get a preview of that very soon, I think in 2 days, actually. So more on that later, right? Um, okay, so let's look now at past tense, right? Sorry, let's stick with future tense. So we just learned that to create the future tense of perfective verbs like прочитать, we simply conjugate them. Okay, but as we've seen, imperfective verbs like читать, they form their future tense using быть as a helping verb, right? Remember those future tense forms of быть that we learned? Буду, будешь, будет, будем, будете, будут, right? That means will, right? I will, you will, he, she, it will, right? So these forms really are a lot like English, right? I will read, you will read, he will read, right? Just future tense forms that are made using a helping verb. So, for example, мы будем читать, we will read, right? Мы будем, right? We're conjugating that будем part and then following that with the infinitive, right? Everyone noticed that, right? Буду, будешь, будет, right? That's the form we're conjugating. But then in all cases, no matter what the subject is, we're following that helping verb with the infinitive читать. Я буду читать, ты будешь читать, он будет читать, and so forth. More on that in a moment. Okay, that leaves past tense. As we've mentioned before, past tense in Russian is extremely easy, almost always. It's very, very easy. Think about what we did with быть, right? We removed the infinitive ending, ch, right, and added l, был, right? And that was our starting point for the past tense form. That was the masculine form with that zero ending, right? And then we added the a or o or e to get our remaining forms, right? Our feminine form, our neuter form, our plural form. Был, была, было, были. Okay, same thing with any other, again, almost any other verb. We'll see exceptions later. But let's take читать, прочитать. Let's start with chitaj, imperfective. How do we make the past tense? We get rid of the infinitive ending, the soft T, and add L, and we get chital, chital. Okay, that's our masculine form. In this case, let's use muy. Let's stick with that example, muy. Okay, that's plural. So we want to say muy chitali, right? There's our plural form, muy chitali. Okay, what about perfective? Same thing, we're just forming it off the perfective verb prочитать. Okay, prочитать, we drop the soft T, the infinitive ending, we add L, and there's our masculine starting form, прочитал, прочитал. Okay, to use that with мы, we want мы прочитали, right? Plural, прочитали, прочитали. Okay, what's the difference? Well, again, same aspectual difference, right? Мы читали could mean we were in the process of reading. We would read, right? Right. We would read habitually or repeatedly, or we were reading in the sense that we were trying to read a novel. We were trying to read our way through a Russian novel, for example, right? That idea of attempt. Meanwhile, the perfective verb прочитали, мы прочитали, could mean we read a book once, right? We read it completely, we read it successfully, right? Bam, it's over, right? So again, this kind of ongoing, repeating, attempt type of idea, читали, 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 versus kind of bam, прочитали. One time, completed, success, result. Okay, so let's look at a bit more detail, right? Let's look at the past tense in more detail, right? We've already basically covered all of our grammar today. Look at this poster, this kind of creepy, nosy Soviet guy asking, "А как ты сегодня работал?" How did you work today? Okay, sounds like kind of a follow-up question, right? What about you, right? How did you work today? Right? The implication is, I've done my work. What about you? Have you fulfilled your quota? That type of thing. Kind of creepy if you think about it. He's even looking over his glasses, right? He's taking a closer look at us, right? I don't know. Maybe he's looking for the calluses on our hands, right, to see if we've worked like a true Soviet laborer. Okay, he can get lost as far as I'm concerned. By the way, we will have worked very hard today if we learn all this stuff in chat. And on day 17, I think we can say that we've worked very diligently. Okay, so past tense. Let's look at all the forms, right? Читать, masculine would be читал, feminine читала, neuter читала with the o, and all plurals would be читали. Okay, we know that already from быть. Now, same thing with прочитать, right? There's no difference in how we're forming the past tense. Aspect doesn't matter in terms of forming it, right? Он прочитал, она прочитала, оно прочитало, они прочитали. Okay, that's pretty easy, right? I mean, that's great news. Now, are there any exceptions to that? Well, let's think about stress. Stress is always a problem, but in the past tense, it's usually not a problem. You see, the stress has stayed where it was on the infinitive, and that will almost always be the case. Читать gave читал, читала, читала, читали, прочитать, прочитал, прочитала, прочитал, прочитали, right? It's not moving around. Now, as always, there are exceptions, right? So the main kind of exceptional stress pattern in the past tense is sometimes called feminine strong. I've seen it called that in certain textbooks. That simply means that in certain verbs, again, fairly limited in number, the feminine ending, the a, will be stressed in the past tense, but the other forms won't be, right? So, for example, жить, right? It follows this pattern. So we get жил, жила, жила, жили, right? So again, only that feminine ending is stressed. Or to take a trickier example, even more exceptional, понять, right, to understand. There we get the stress on the feminine ending, but then in all the other forms, it jumps back actually onto the prefix по. Okay, so we don't get pañal, pañala, pañala, pañali, as we might expect. Instead, we get poño, poñala, right? There's that feminine strong pattern. Poñala, poñali. Okay, so that's a bit tricky. We'll look out for those, and at some point we'll specify which verbs that we've seen so far follow that pattern. But in terms of major exceptions to the stress rule in the past, that's the main one by far. Okay, let's look at an exercise just focusing on past tense forms. Okay, let's take готовить, and again, we just want to make sure it matches with our subject in terms of gender, or maybe it's plural, in which case we need to make sure the past tense form is plural. Okay, what about on? On готовил, right? Masculine. Она готовила, right? Keeping the stress where it is on the infinitive. Они, plural, готовили, готовили. What about сделать? Okay, let's take ты. Now keep in mind that's a singular, right? You singular. That could be feminine or masculine, right? It depends on who we're talking to, right? Ты, feminine, that would be ты сделала, сделала. Or ты, masculine, ты сделал, сделал. What about вы? That would be you polite or you plural. That's, of course, plural in either case, right? Grammatically, it's going to be plural. Вы сделали. Вы сделали. Okay, by the way, we're not really focusing here just yet on aspect, right? Just on forming the past tense of various verbs, but might point out that готовить is imperfective, so that would mean the forms we just created would mean he was preparing, she was preparing, they were preparing, right? They were in the process. This could also mean cooking, right? In the sense of preparing food. He was cooking, she was cooking, they were cooking. In the sense maybe that they were in the process of cooking dinner. Meanwhile, сделать is perfective, right? So сделать doesn't mean to go about doing something. It means to get something done, right? It's perfective, right? So kind of he did something, he finished something, right? You feminine finished, you masculine finished, you plural finished. You got it done, perfected. Okay, but again, let's just for now just focus on the right form. Umieć, past tense, to know how to do something. Ya, okay, ya is singular, it can also be masculine or feminine. Ya, masculine, umiel. Ya umiel, feminine speaker would say ya umiela, and мы is plural, мы umieli, we knew how to do something. That's imperfective. Okay, number 4, the perfective of pisać is napisać. So we would use this perfective form napisać to talk about getting something written, right? Finishing our writing. Они, okay, that's plural. Они написали, they wrote, they got something written. Вы, also plural. You all or you polite. Вы написали, мы написали, right? So all these forms are plural, right? So they're all going to be написали. That's our only option in the plural. Okay, смотреть, that's imperfective, meaning to be in the process of watching, right? The activity of watching. Okay, все, everyone, that's plural. Все смотрели. Все смотрели. He was watching. Он смотрел. Or она смотрела. Okay, нарисовать. There's an ova verb. Okay, remember in ova verbs, we talked about if we conjugate those in the present, or it could be future if it's a perfective form. Basically, those conjugated forms, we said the ova collapses to an u. Okay, but that's only in conjugated forms, right? Here in the past tense is something different, right? We're working straight from the infinitive, right? We're getting rid of the soft T and adding L, right? So again, for the vast majority of verbs, that process is very straightforward. We're going straight from the infinitive. There's no funny business. There's no ova becoming oo. There's none of that stuff, right? So Again, remember in Russian, past tense, easy, right? Past tense is usually very easy. Don't overthink it. Okay, so in this example, I нарисовать is perfective. So this would describe getting something drawn, right? Drawing it completely or successfully. Okay, female speaker, я нарисовала. Ты, speaking to a female, нарисовала, same form. Она, she, again, still feminine. She нарисовала. Она нарисовала. She got something drawn. Okay, жить. Okay, watch the stress. Remember, we mentioned this shows that feminine strong pattern. Я жил, masculine. Я female. Я жила, I lived. Я жила, мы жили. Right? Мы, plural, жили. Okay, number 8, понять. Okay, this is the really tricky stress pattern. And by the way, we've seen already that понять is one of the craziest verbs. Well, it is the craziest verb we've seen so far. It's just bonkers in all sorts of ways, right? Okay, anyway, он понял, она поняла, они поняли. All right, so tricky stress pattern. But again, we know that verb понять is kind of crazy in its conjugated forms. Пойму, поймешь, right? But again, in the past tense, in terms of the form, the spelling, there's nothing unusual, right? Понял, right? Поняла. The only question is the stress, right? That's the tricky part. Понял, поняла, поняли. But otherwise, there's nothing irregular about this form. Here's a quick proverb, a really nice one, quite commonly heard. Бабушка надвое сказала. Grandma said надвое, right? Надвое means, it's kind of hard to translate. It means she wanted to kind of have it both ways, right? It means kind of ambiguously in two different ways, right? Meaning that grandma wasn't quite clear. Okay, so it's kind of a funny folk saying. It's kind of like in English, we say the jury's still out on that one, right? Бабушка надвое сказала, right? The jury's still out. It's still an open question. Okay, let's look at one more exercise, and now let's think more about the aspectual distinction in the past tense, right? Let's take an aspectual pair, делать, сделать, to do, right? And let's first just form the past tense, right, for each aspect. What about on? Well, the forms would be делал for imperfective and сделал for perfective, right? So we have these two forms, делал, сделал. Okay, so we have to choose between those to try to express, right, what kind of activity we're talking about, right? So let's look at these English examples and just we don't have much context here, but let's try to get a sense of the gist of the English and how we would express that through our choice of aspect in Russian. What was he doing yesterday? Okay, note that past continuous tense. What was he doing? Well, that's one way in English of getting across this idea of activity, right? We're not asking what he got done. We're asking what was he doing? What was he up to yesterday? Okay, what aspect do you think we'd use for that to get that across in Russian? Imperfective, of course, right? So we're going to use делал. Okay, so let's, how would we translate the full sentence? Что он делал вчера? Что он делал вчера? What was he up to yesterday? What was he in the process of doing yesterday, right? Okay, what about она? What are the two past tense forms for она? Well, imperfective would be делала. Perfective would be сделала. Okay, let's choose between them to ask in Russian, what did she get done yesterday? Okay, what is that English question, what does it seem to be getting at? Well, we're thinking about result, right? We're not asking what was she up to. We're asking about her accomplishment, her results, right? Her completed activity. Okay, so what aspect do we need? Perfective, right? Of course. Что она сделала вчера? Что она сделала вчера? It's clearly a perfective aspect situation. Okay, let's take plural examples. Они. Okay, past tense of делать would be делали, and perfective would be сделали. Okay, that's easy to form. Now let's choose, right? What did they usually do? Or we could say, what would they usually do? Or, yeah, that type of thing. What did they used to do, right? Uh, and I guess there are different ways to say that in English. Okay, so what aspect would that be in Russian? Think carefully. This is criterion number 2, imperfective, right? Because this is asking about repetition, right? Now, that word обычно, usually, we're going to call that, as we'll learn tomorrow, a red flag, right? We see the word обычно, usually, it's asking about repetition, right? You can't have usually without the idea of repetition, right? So that word is telling us clearly we have to have imperfective here. So the question would be, что они обычно делали? Что они обычно делали? What would they usually do? What did they usually do? That type of question. Okay, let's do one more pair. Готовить, приготовить, which means to prepare, and specifically food, right? So when we use this verb, we're usually going to mean it in terms of cooking. Okay, so let's think. Готовить, perfective, means the activity of cooking, right? Приготовить, the perfective, means finishing cooking, right? Successfully completing, that type of idea. Okay, let's form the masculine past tense forms for both aspects. Он готовил, он приготовил. Okay, now let's choose to translate an English statement. He cooked dinner yesterday. Okay, let's think about this one. We have just a simple past verb in English, he cooked, right? As opposed, for example, to he used to cook, or he would cook, or he was cooking, right? Those would imply something different, right? We'll see that there's no direct correspondence between English tense and Russian aspect, right? It's tempting to think maybe there is. Generally, there isn't really, but sometimes English tense can give us a very good clue as to what aspect we need. For example, we've already seen that if you have past continuous, like he was cooking, that would call for imperfective. But often simple past, simple future, very often that'll call for a perfective verb in Russian. He cooked dinner yesterday. Now, another clue here is the yesterday part. We assume you only ate dinner once yesterday, so this sounds very clearly like a one-time action. He cooked dinner yesterday, right? Just a one-time action. There's no emphasis here on the activity, on the attempt, right? It just sounds like he cooked dinner, just kind of a simple one-time fact. Okay, so we're going to choose perfective, right? Он приготовил. Он приготовил ужин вчера. Okay, what about let's do feminine. Она готовила, она приготовила. She was cooking dinner yesterday. Okay, now look at that tense difference here. That's a pretty good clue that she was cooking, that the English is emphasizing the activity. And so we're going to choose what aspect in Russian? Imperfective, right? Она готовила ужин вчера. Okay, now you see how that choice of aspect describes two very different things. He cooked dinner, right? We're emphasizing the result, the completion, whereas она готовила ужин gets across the idea of she was cooking. And again, immediately in the listener's mind, that choice of aspect conjures up very different images, right? Он приготовил ужин, it kind of conjures up here's the dinner he cooked, right? He completely prepared dinner, and wow, look at the dinner. Whereas if we hear она готовила ужин, that imperfective just immediately in the Russian mind conjures up this idea of her kind of stirring the pot, right? Going about cooking dinner, slicing vegetables or whatever, the process, right? So again, that choice of aspect in the mind of a native speaker is going to immediately conjure up those types of images. Anyway, let's go on to the third example, они, so plural. Они готовили, они приготовили. Okay, let's choose between those forms. They rarely cooked dinner. Okay, what aspect? This is going to be criterion number 2. Imperfective, because we're talking about repetition. Okay, this may at first seem a bit odd, right? I mean, Riedka means rarely, right? Rarely. But that actually is going to be a red flag for imperfective because rarely too is talking about repetition, right? Not a lot of repetition, right? But some repetition, right? If you say I did something rarely, well, it means presumably you did it more than once, but not often, but you did, it was a repeated action. Okay, so again, anytime we are implying repetition, whether it's repeated just once or many, many times, right? Right? Whether it's rarely or often or always, all of those things are going to call clearly for imperfective aspect, right? So the answer here is Они редко готовили ужин. Они редко готовили ужин. Okay, let's talk about forming the future tense. So we've already looked at this, right? The aspectual distinction here is really important, right? So at least in terms of the forms, right? Uh, in the past tense, right, forming the past was the same regardless of aspect, right? In the future, remember, perfective verbs, we simply conjugate them, right? Using the same patterns we learned a few days ago, right? And those forms like прочитаю, прочитаешь, прочитает are automatically future tense. But for imperfective verbs like читать, we use буду, будешь, будет as a helping verb. Now again, it's that part, буду, будешь, будет, that we're changing to agree with the subject, right? And then we're following it with the infinitive, right? So this is another rather common mistake, right? The Russian for I will read is я буду читать. It's not я буду читаю. See what's happened, right? Some students often, well, they want to conjugate the verb the way they're used to doing, right? Я читаю would mean I am reading, right? Present tense. But in the future, we don't say я буду читаю, right? The only thing we're manipulating is the form буду, будешь, будет, right? Я буду, and then no matter what that form is, we follow it with the infinitive. Я буду читать, ты будешь читать, он будет читать, and so forth. Okay, so let's do the same thing as we did in the previous exercise, right? Let's make two future tense forms, right? The only distinction being aspect, and then choose the proper one to convey the gist of an English sentence, right? So let's take вы, and let's do the pair делать, сделать, вы. Okay, you will do, делать. Okay, вы. Now, делать is imperfective, right? So we're going to need the compound future. We get вы. Okay, let's think. What's that form? Буду, будешь, будет, будем, будете, будут, right? Будете. Вы будете делать. Вы будете делать versus вы. Okay, we just need to conjugate this. Сделаете, сделаете, right? Remember the I verb? Читаю, читаешь, читает, читаем, читаете. Сделаю, сделаешь, сделает, сделаем, сделаете, сделаете. Okay, now again, what is the difference between those two future tense forms we've just made? Well, again, the same aspectual distinction we've talked about, right? Вы будете делать has the idea of you will be doing something, right? You'll be in the process of doing something, working at it, trying to get it done, etc., etc., or maybe doing it repeatedly, right? Whereas вы сделаете is just kind of bam, right? You will get it done, one time, completion, success, result, and all that stuff. Okay, so let's translate these English sentences based on that distinction. What will you be doing tomorrow? Or maybe in more colloquial English, what'll you be up to tomorrow? Okay, that's asking not about some result, but just about the activity. How will you spend your day? Okay, so what aspect would we choose? Right, imperfective. So we'd ask something like, что вы будете делать завтра? Что вы будете делать завтра? Whereas number two, what will you get done tomorrow? Okay, that's clearly focused on result, accomplishment, completion. So we need to choose perfective, and that would be что вы сделаете завтра? Что вы сделаете завтра? Now again, that choice of aspect, a Russian hears those two questions, they're going to understand them in very different ways, right? Okay, let's take pisать, napisать. Okay, and we're using on. Okay, he will write imperfective. Он будет писать. Он будет писать. What about написать? Okay, for perfective future, we just need to conjugate the perfective form. That would be, remember, verbs. Он напишет. Он напишет. Mutation, shifting stress. Okay, number 3, he'll write a letter tomorrow. Well, that's again just a simple future tense in English. Sounds like a one-time event. There's no mention of effort or attempt or simply going about the process. So we'll use perfective. Он напишет письмо завтра. Okay, what about, let's translate the next one. 4, he'll write a letter every day. Okay, what aspect? This should be an easy one. Imperfective, right? Why? Because every day, right? Every day is a clear giveaway that we're talking about repetition. We have to have imperfective in Russian. Okay, so let's say он будет писать письмо. And the Russian for every day is каждый день. We'll learn that more actively very soon. Он будет писать письмо каждый день. Okay, last pair, рисовать, нарисовать, right? To draw. Okay, she will draw imperfective. Она будет рисовать. Она будет рисовать. Versus perfective, нарисовать. Okay, we just need to conjugate that, right? And it'll be future tense and meaning. Ova collapses to u. Она нарисует. Она нарисует. Okay, let's choose between those two. Number 5, she'll be drawing a poster. Okay, again, look at that future continuous tense, right? She'll be drawing it, right? Not simply she'll draw it, but she'll be drawing it. Sounds like we're emphasizing the process for whatever reason. So let's use imperfective. Она будет рисовать плакат. Versus number 6, she'll get it drawn tomorrow. Okay, that certainly sounds like we're emphasizing accomplishment, right? So we'll use perfective. Она нарисует завтра. Okay, we're missing our it. Remember from yesterday, we need его, right? We need the accusative of on, right? Плакат is on, it's masculine. So we need его. Она его нарисует завтра. Okay, that does it. You see here kind of a master chart, just looking at all the different possible forms of this aspectual pair, читать, прочитать. That's a nice little summary of everything we've learned today. And well, maybe it's not too difficult, right? I mean, hopefully. I mean, of course, the past tense is very easy. The future isn't really too difficult either. So in terms of these forms, hopefully you're fairly comfortable with them at this point. So review them. And again, if you feel at all comfortable with the stuff in this table, that is a lot of Russian grammar in one table right there. I did mention earlier one nice way to think just generally about aspect that we'll return to when we get to advanced aspect is bounded action versus unbounded action, right? Basically, perfective verbs tend to describe action that's bounded or limited or specific in some way, right? If we think about that kind of one time, right, completed action versus action that's ongoing, right? It's kind of unbounded in that sense. It has no clear end, right? Okay, so that's kind of a nice way to think about it, although I think it doesn't quite account for all of the aspectual distinctions, so it's not quite that simple. I've tried to spell out the difference in kind of more carefully. Okay, let's now take some more aspectual pairs and again try to capture the gist of an English sentence through our choice of aspect in Russian. Now here we're jumbling all three different tenses, so we've got to think very carefully about tense. And I've warned people, I've warned you in this series before that a lot of students tend to think a lot about aspect, but then they just completely forget about tense, right? Which should not be the hard part, right? Tense, especially in Russian, right? We've got past, present, future. We've got only those three choices, and the difference is pretty, I mean, basically just crystal clear, right? So there should be really no ambiguity whatsoever about what tense you need, right? I mean, actually, getting the right form may be a different story, but in theory, tense in Russian should be easy. Okay, so let's start with our pair pisать написать. I'm writing an article. Okay, what aspect do we need? Well, uh, it's the activity, it's the process, blah, blah, blah. No, we're overthinking it. We're overthinking it. Okay, this is even more simple than all that. What tense do we have? I am writing. Present tense. Okay, so if we're in the present tense, our we're done thinking, right? We don't have to really choose between aspect at all. It's got to be imperfective, right? Present tense has to be imperfective. There's no question about it in Russian. Okay, so that would give us я пишу статью, right? The accusative of статья, article is статью. Okay, have you written the letter? Okay, that's going to be past tense, right? Again, here we're actually using present perfect in English, but we're talking about an accomplishment, right? Have you written that letter? It sounds like we're focused on the result, right? The completion of the action. And we're talking to a feminine ты. Okay, so let's say ты написала письмо. Ты написала письмо, right? Did you get it written? Have you completely written it? Ты написала письмо. Okay, number three, I'll get it written tomorrow. Okay, again, sounds like result oriented. Я его, right, the accusative of одно. Я его напишу завтра, right? Future tense, perfective. I'll get it written. I'll get it done. Okay, number four. My mom used to cook dinner. Okay, we're working with готовить, приготовить. What aspect do we need? Repetition, right? She used to cook it. That's repetition. She did it more than once. That's imperfective, clearly. Okay, so mama, mama. And now remember, we don't have to say Maya mama. We could say that, but we're going to assume you're talking about your own mother. So Russians will typically drop the possessive adjective, whereas we can't really do that. Well, we usually don't do that in English. Of course, we could say mom used to cook dinner, but okay, anyway, in Russian, mama готовила ужин. But now I cook it. Okay, what aspect do we need? Well, oh my God, it's the process? Is it repetition? No, remember, it's present tense, so we don't have to think very hard about this one. Present tense, we have to have imperfective. Теперь, right? Но теперь я его готовлю. Right? Present tense, I prepare it. That's one of those labials, right? Готов, labial mutation, я готовлю. Но теперь я его готовлю. Okay, number six, I'll be cooking every evening. Okay, I will be cooking. It's future tense. We're talking about the future. Every evening is another clue, right? Repetition. It's got to be imperfective. Okay, so how do we make the future of this imperfective verb? Готовить. Well, we need the compound future, right? Я буду готовить каждый вечер. Каждый вечер. Okay, again, we'll learn more about this каждый stuff later. Okay, number seven. Who paid for lunch yesterday? We're using платить, заплатить. Okay, sounds like a one-time thing, right? This was lunch yesterday. This is a one-time event, presumably. Someone paid for the lunch. Sounds like perfective to me, right? Кто? Now remember the кто, that question word is masculine singular always in terms of agreement, right? Grammatical agreement. So even though we could be speaking about a woman here, grammatically the verb is still going to be masculine. Кто заплатил за обед вчера? Кто заплатил за обед вчера? My father, мой отец, right? Or мой papa, he always pays. Okay, that's present tense. On top of that, here we have the always, right? The repetition, clearly imperfective. Он всегда платит. Он всегда платит. Dad always pays for lunch. Okay, number 9. He always paid and he always will. Okay, now there we've got two different cases, right? Repetition in the past, repetition in the future, right? He'll always do it. Clearly, we need imperfective. Он всегда платил, past tense, и всегда будет платить. Right? Он всегда платил, он всегда будет платить. Okay, one more. Говорить versus сказать. This is the pair for to say, to speak, to talk, to say, to tell. Okay, she used to talk a lot. Okay, sounds like her habit, right? She used to talk a lot. We need imperfective, right? This was an ongoing repetition type of habitual thing. Okay, so она много, okay, it's past tense. Она много говорила. Она много говорила. Okay, what did she say? Okay, let's think about that English. That really seems to be a one-time thing. Like, hey, I know you talked to Susie yesterday. What did she say? What did she say? Что она сказала? Что она сказала? Would be probably the most appropriate thing there. Now, again, with some of these English examples, there may be some ambiguity. We don't have a lot of context here, so sometimes you can kind of overthink it a bit. And in that case, you might try to ask yourself, what would it mean if we did choose the other form, right? Instead of что она сказала, what if we said что она говорила? Well, that would mean something more like what was she saying, right? What говорила is the process, this sort of ongoing thing. What was she talking about, maybe? What was she saying? Or that type of thing. Versus что она сказала is just simply what did she say? Okay, number 12, what will she say? Well, again, let's just think of a quick scenario. What will she say when she hears about this? Okay, it sounds like kind of a one-time utterance, right? Like what is going to come out of her mouth? What will she say? How will she respond to this? That would be что она скажет. Что она скажет, perfective. Right? Now again, the imperfective version would be что она будет говорить. Okay, and that sounds just more like something, an ongoing speech or something. What will she say? Or maybe repetition. What will she say repeatedly when you'll say to her repeatedly this, that, or the other, right? So it sounds a little bit more like an unusual situation as opposed to simply, what will she say when she hears this? Что она скажет? Okay, that's it for today's lesson. May seem a bit overwhelming, but we'll continue to work with Aspect, and very soon we'll talk about a couple of things, different clues, we'll call them red flags, that will help us choose between Aspect and Russian. And also we'll talk more about how these aspectual pairs are created in the first place, right? But anyway, we've learned a lot today. And anyway, try to digest it as best you can. And until next time, до свидания, товарищи.